Ronald Reagan was President of the United States from 1980 to 1989. And in this tutorial, we're going to look at both his domestic policy, his policy at home, but also his foreign policy. So his attitudes, particularly towards the Soviet Union and towards Russia. Starting off with his domestic policy, his biggest and most significant policy was nicknamed Reaganomics. Reaganomics was a combination of cutting taxes and cutting benefits and by cutting the taxes, particularly for the richer people in society, or certainly business people, business taxes and personal taxes, those businesses will then invest. So it's promoting investment from business. That was really the aim. And when that investment comes, there will be a trickle-down effect. So those businesses investing will create more jobs. They will raise wages within their companies. Businesses will expand, and therefore the people at the bottom of the spectrum, either the poor people or the people without jobs, will automatically benefit from that. And because of that benefit, because of that trickle-down effect benefit, it actually meant that he could also cut benefits, which was controversial because one of his biggest benefit cuts was actually for single mothers. But ultimately, this was an economic plan that he thought was going to work. The question is, did it work? Well, first of all, looking at the graph that you can see on screen now, during Reagan's presidency, unemployment did drop. It did drop, but if you actually look at it over the course of his entire presidency, in 1980 when he became president, it was around about 6%. In 1989, it was around about 5%. But what you also need to consider there is the fact there was an economic recession in between, in the mid-1980s. So he had a recession to deal with at the same time. So it wasn't just, that things globally were good for him. So to actually manage to reduce unemployment as much as he did in this second term, from 1984 to 89, or 85 to 89, in his second term is actually a big achievement. I mean, you can see that on the graph. It has gone down. However, by cutting the taxes, it also means that you reduce the amount of money the government's getting in. Now, that means that the government technically should spend less, which was Reagan's big idea. If the government spends more, then you're in a bit of a mess. And what that's going to actually create is a deficit. So a gap between what you're bringing in and what you're paying out is going to produce debt. And that means you're going to have to lend. You're going to have to lend off other countries. And in fact, when Reagan left office in 1989, the USA had the biggest budget deficit in the world. So he had overspent. And that budget deficit would continue to grow under the Bush administration. It was actually Clinton in the mid-90s, in 1997, 1998, who actually managed to balance the budget because Reagan had overspent. And so I mean, if you were to balance the success and failure of Reaganomics, yes, he reduced unemployment and yes, he created jobs. And so in that respect, you would see it as a success. And the tax cut was incredibly popular with people, you have to remember. But in fact, halfway through his presidency, he did have to increase taxes again. So there was a massive initial reduction when he became president, but gradually he did have to actually increase it. And he was responsible for one of the biggest tax increases in presidential history as well, as reducing it by the biggest amount. So it swings and roundabouts a little bit there. Why was there this deficit when he's cutting benefits as well? A lot of it centered around actually his foreign policy and his foreign policy spending. And his big project from 1983 onwards, from 1983 onwards was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or the SDI, and this was nicknamed in the press the Star Wars Project. The Star Wars Project, which would cost $24 billion from 1983 onwards, was in effect an idea of putting satellites into space to stop Russian missiles getting through to America. So they would intercept the missiles and blow them up in midair, and it would all be done by satellites in space. This was using technology that didn't exist at that time. It was probably technology that was 10, 15, 20 years before its making. And Reagan poured lots and lots of money into this. And some people see Star Wars actually as ending the Cold War because the Russians realized they couldn't compete with Star Wars. So what that meant was the Russians thought, well, we're having an arms race here with America. We're in the middle of the Cold War. But actually we're realizing we can't compete with that kind of financial muscle. The amount of money the Americans are putting into this, and whether it's successful or not, we can't do it. We can't compete on that level. So what that meant was the Russians actually went to the negotiating table with Reagan. Gorbachev, the Russian leader, went to the arms limitation conferences, and the beginning of the end of the Cold War was actually enacted. And some people really do credit the Star Wars program. Some people say it was a complete waste of money, when you've got to remember America was in the middle of a recession in the mid-1980s. So, 1984, massive unemployment. But ultimately, others see it as something that actually benefited in the long term because it ended the Cold War. Ultimately, Reagan, who was known as the Great Communicator, he was an ex-Hollywood actor. He'd starred in films alongside the likes of James Dean. He was known as the Great Communicator, a fantastic public speaker who survived an assassination attempt, had a fantastic charisma about him. And these two policies in different ways actually endeared the American people to him rather than against him. And he is actually in the top 10 most popular American presidents consistently when it comes to polling. He was conservative. Some see him as slightly right-wing, but nevertheless, his policies, his approach, the way he went about things has made him popular amongst, particularly amongst conservatives in America.